For 13 years, Wyatt Hale drove Evelyn Carrington home and quietly disappeared. He never stepped through the doors she closed behind her, never permitted himself to wonder what waited on the other side. But after a tense board meeting one Tuesday night, the CEO did something she had never done. She pressed a hotel key into his palm and whispered one word into the rearview mirror: "Tonight." Near midnight, he stood before the door and slid the key into the lock. The door swung open. Within seconds, his expression changed completely. Because what waited on the other side looked nothing like anything he had imagined. Stay with this story to the end and find out whether that key was an invitation or a trap. Wyatt Hale was not the kind of man who drew attention to himself, and that was precisely why he had survived in a world designed to consume quiet people. He was 45 years old, broad-shouldered, with the stillness that people sometimes mistook for simplicity, a former luxury vehicle technician who understood engines the way other men understood politics, by listening to everything and saying very little. He had been driving for the Carrington family since Evelyn was a junior director who read contracts in the back seat with the focused attention of someone who understood that words were the most dangerous thing in any room. In 13 years, he had carried her through nearly every defining moment of her professional life. The morning she was publicly attacked in print by a financial columnist, whose work later turned out to be purchased, the night her father, Harlan Carrington, was first admitted to the hospital with chest pains, and the cold, clear morning she formally became CEO of Carrington Meridian Group, and the cameras outside the building made the street look like something that needed to be survived rather than celebrated. What most people in Evelyn's orbit did not understand, what she herself had never acknowledged aloud, was that Wyatt's salary had been set well above market rate from his second year of employment, that she had rerouted her own schedule on 3 occasions without explanation when something in the day's logistics did not account for him, and that in 13 years, she had not replaced him despite 2 separate restructuring proposals from her security team. She was not a warm woman by professional reputation. But she remembered the anniversary of his wife's death, kept track of his daughter Paige's academic calendar, and had once, wordlessly, chosen a longer route home through a neighborhood he had mentioned offhand that Paige wanted to study in her urban design program. 2 people could share a contained space across a decade and develop a form of knowing that required no declaration. Not friendship, not romance, not purely employment, but something quieter and more durable that both of them had agreed, without discussing it, to leave unnamed. The crisis at Carrington Meridian had been building for months before it broke open. The board of directors, led by Malcolm Ashbourne, was preparing to vote on the sale of Carrington Grand, a lakefront landmark that had operated under the family name for more than 5 decades, to Ashbourne Capital, a firm Malcolm controlled through investment structures deliberately assembled to resist clarity. Malcolm was 57, polished, and had been Harlan Carrington's closest friend and financial advisor for nearly 3 decades. Which gave him enormous institutional weight in a company still adjusting to leadership without Harlan's presence. He presented the hotel as a liability: aging infrastructure, declining occupancy numbers, a restoration estimate that unsettled the finance committee. What he did not present was that his own team had prepared a valuation structured to come in 30% below market, that the debt service projections had been selectively manipulated, or that beneath the hotel's basement floors sat a mechanical archive of paper records predating the company's digital systems by 2 full decades, records he needed destroyed before anyone thought to look for them. Evelyn had not been able to prove the valuation was engineered. She had sensed it, the way she sensed most things designed to appear settled, through the absence of information that should have been there. When Harlan's estate was processed 10 months after his death, His personal safe had contained a sealed envelope bearing one instruction in his handwriting: open only when the board votes to sell the grand. Inside was a brass hotel key etched with the number 1308, and beneath it 11 words: "Give it to the man who still drives you home." There was no additional letter, no instructions beyond that sentence. Evelyn had turned the key over in her hands for 3 days before the scheduled board session, and when Malcolm stood at the head of the table announcing that a preliminary agreement had already been drafted, she felt the small brass weight in her coat pocket and made a decision she could not fully articulate, except to say that she trusted her father's instincts even when she was angry at him for keeping secrets. The meeting ended without a formal vote only because she called a procedural delay on grounds of incomplete documentation, a maneuver that bought 48 hours and earned her a long, expressionless look from Malcolm that she interpreted as confirmation that she was right to be afraid. When she reached the car and saw the security vehicle that had been following her all evening still idling at the corner, she understood that whatever the key led to, she could not explain it in any way a listening device would not transmit. Malcolm was walking toward the car. She had 30 seconds. She leaned forward, pressed the key into Wyatt's palm, held his eyes in the mirror for exactly 2 seconds, and said the only word that communicated urgency without explanation: "Tonight." Wyatt looked down at the brass key in his palm and saw the Carrington Grand insignia on its back. He looked up again. Evelyn was already out of the car, and Malcolm's hand was at her elbow in a gesture that was technically courteous and functionally controlling. Wyatt sat still for a moment. Then he put the car in drive. Carrington Grand had not been fully operational in 6 months. The upper floors were dark, the kitchen decommissioned, and the remaining staff were maintenance workers completing inventory assessments before anticipated closure. Wyatt entered through the service entrance. The brass key, he discovered, operated a mechanical deadbolt on a side stairwell door that was not connected to the electronic access system, and climbed 7 flights of service corridor until he reached a landing with a small painted marker reading 13. Room 1308 was set behind a secondary door that did not appear on any guest-facing floor plan, positioned between a linen closet and a utility shaft, accessible only to someone who knew exactly where to look. The space beyond was not a guest room. It was a preserved office, deliberately kept, with a wooden desk and a single reading lamp and the stillness of a place arranged by someone who expected to return and had not. On the desk, organized with clear intention, were 4 items: a manila folder bearing the typed name Elise Hale, a ledger from a company registered as Northbridge Hospitality, a compact voice recorder with a strip of tape reading "Play First," and an open wall safe whose door hung at an angle that told Wyatt immediately he was not the first person in that room that evening. The safe was empty. He pressed play on the recorder. Harlan Carrington's voice was slower than Wyatt remembered, with the cadence of someone who had rehearsed a difficult thing and still found it hard to say. Harlan explained that Elise Hale, an internal auditor who had worked for Carrington Meridian for 6 years, had discovered a pattern of financial transfers routed through Northbridge Hospitality, a company with no genuine operations, no real employees, structured specifically to redirect money from the company's employee retirement fund at intervals that fell below the automatic audit threshold. Elise had prepared a complete report. She had brought it to Harlan personally. Harlan's voice did not claim he had disbelieved her. It claimed something worse, that he had believed every word and chosen, in that moment, not to act. The door locked before the recording finished. The electronic bolt, still live and apparently set to trigger when the recorder was accessed, engaged with a sound like a rifle being chambered, and the hotel's security alert began broadcasting. His name and vehicle plate had been provided to the responding officers before he ever parked the car. He understood then that the person who built the trap had known exactly who Evelyn would give the key to, which meant the trap was not improvised. It had been waiting. Wyatt did not try to flee or force the door. He filmed every surface of the room with his phone, called the attorney whose card he had carried for 4 years without expecting to use, and positioned himself in the center of the space with his hands visible by the time the officers arrived. He surrendered the key. He declined to hand the Elise Hale folder to the corporate security team that appeared alongside the police, citing active legal consultation. They walked him through the lobby, and when he looked up through the crowd that had gathered outside, he saw Evelyn, with Malcolm standing directly beside her, one hand at her shoulder, say in a carrying, composed voice to the nearest officer that, to his knowledge, this man had never been given any key by the CEO, that he had no authorized access to the property, and that whatever he claimed she had said to him was the fabrication of a disgruntled employee who had overstepped his position. Evelyn's face across the distance did not move, but her eyes, for a fraction of a second, found Wyatt's. Jordan Pike had kept Evelyn inside the corporate headquarters building for 40 minutes after the board meeting ended, citing a security threat he could not substantiate when she pressed him for specifics, but which had been specific enough to delay her departure until Wyatt was already inside the hotel and the trap was ready to spring. Malcolm had used those 40 minutes well. By the time the security alert triggered and the officers arrived, he had a prepared statement for Evelyn to review, one that characterized the incident as an attempted theft of proprietary documents by a trusted employee who had exploited long-standing access for personal gain. The statement required only one thing of her: silence about the key. She did not give it. Standing outside the Grand with reporters already arriving and Malcolm's hand at her elbow, she said, clearly, for everyone present, that she had placed the key in Wyatt Hale's hand herself, that he had entered the property at her direct request as CEO, and that any other characterization was incorrect. It removed the criminal exposure from Wyatt's situation entirely. Malcolm abandoned the theft angle immediately and shifted to a more sophisticated position, that Wyatt had manipulated a compromised CEO into granting him access, that his motives were financial, that the materials could have been altered. It was harder to disprove quickly, which was why it had been prepared in advance. By the following morning, someone had released a photograph taken through the car window, grainy, time-stamped, showing Evelyn leaning forward in the back seat, her hand extended toward the driver's partition. Without context, it communicated exactly what Malcolm's camp intended. Headlines were careful with their language the way they are, when implying something unprintable. The board received a formal request from 3 of Malcolm's aligned members to suspend Wyatt's employment, pending an internal review. Wyatt submitted personal leave paperwork directly to Human Resources without contacting Evelyn, and drove home in his own car. He sat at the kitchen table and read the Elise Hale folder for 3 hours. His wife had not resigned from Carrington Meridian. She had been placed under an internal compliance investigation after accessing accounts she had every right to access as an auditor. She had been given a choice between signing a non-disclosure agreement and contesting the investigation at a moment when she was already in treatment, when Paige was 12 years old, and when Wyatt's salary was the household's only income. She had signed. She had told Wyatt she was leaving because the environment had become difficult. She had not told him the rest. When Evelyn came to him 2 days later, not to his office but to his home address, which she had known for 13 years without ever using, he let her in and told her what the folder contained. She listened without speaking. When he finished, he asked whether she had genuinely not known about her father's decision or whether she had simply never allowed herself to ask. She said she had not known. He said he believed her. Then he said that not knowing was a defense for what had already happened, but it could not be a defense for the silence she was now contemplating. Camille Sutton, the independent attorney designated as custodian for the second portion of Harlan's contingency plan, arrived in Chicago on a Thursday and spent 6 hours reviewing the materials before determining that 4 pages had been removed from the folder prior to Wyatt's arrival in room 1308. Based on the binding indentations still visible, those pages had contained a dated list of approval signatures. Without them, the chain of authorization for the Northbridge transfers was incomplete, and without the chain, Malcolm could argue the remaining documents were out-of-context fragments, potentially altered. The 4 missing pages, Camille determined, had contained meetings at which fund transfer approvals had been co-signed under Evelyn's name as corporate co-signatory. If those signatures were authentic, the fraud implicated the current CEO. If they were forged, proving it required placing Evelyn elsewhere on each of those dates. The problem was that digital calendar systems could be edited. What could not be edited were the handwritten logbooks Wyatt had kept in a locked cabinet at his house for 13 years, 1 volume per year, each entry made within the hour of every completed trip. He had started the practice because an early supervisor had told him that a driver's only protection against disputes over timing and conduct was his own record. He had continued it because precision had become ritual. Malcolm Ashbourne had once made a remark in the back seat about the notebooks being charmingly analog, the kind of observation that sounds like a compliment and functions as a dismissal. The notebooks recorded departure times, arrival times, odometer readings, passenger names, notable stops, waiting periods, and occasional brief observations. They contained no conversations. Wyatt had never written down a word Evelyn had said, but he had recorded in his even and unembellished hand exactly where she had been. A contract Malcolm's team presented as evidence documented a meeting between Evelyn and Malcolm at Carrington Grand on the evening of the 17th of September. Wyatt's logbook for that date recorded that he had driven her to Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 6:47 in the evening, waited in the visitor parking structure for 112 minutes, and returned her to the Carrington residence at 10 past 10. He had noted that she had asked him to avoid the bridge on the northern route, which he had understood, without being told, was because the bridge passed within sight of the cardiac unit where Harlan was admitted. A fuel receipt, a traffic camera image, and a parking validation ticket from the hospital's visitor structure all confirmed the entry exactly. When Evelyn came to the garage to review the logbooks with Camille, she moved through the volumes slowly. She found, across 13 years of entries, the quiet architecture of everything she had not said, and he had not asked, and both of them had understood. Notes about which hospital entrance she preferred on difficult evenings. A record of the time she had asked him to circle the park 3 times with no explanation, which he had done without a word. The morning after a particularly public attack by a competitor's communications team, when the log read simply, "Long way home, requested, done." She had not asked for any of it to be preserved. He had preserved it because that was what he did with things that seemed important and had nowhere else to go. The final discovery in that session was the worst, the logbook page for the 3rd of November. The date that corresponded, as Wyatt now knew, to the night Elise had brought her audit report to Harlan, had been torn out cleanly along the binding. The edges were precise. Someone had been inside his house. He did not need to be told what that night had been. He remembered it in the way you remember things whose significance becomes clear only years later. Elise had asked him to drive her to Carrington Grand after dinner on a weeknight. She told Paige she needed to drop off something for work. She carried a folder and a padded envelope and was inside the hotel for just over 2 hours, while Wyatt sat in the car listening to a radio program. When she returned, she was entirely quiet. Not the quietness of resolution, but of someone who had done something irreversible, and was deciding how to live with it. At a traffic light 3 blocks from their house, she put her hand over his and asked him to promise that if anything ever happened to her, he would keep his job with the Carrington family. He had said, of course, he had thought she was worried about her health. He had not imagined she was protecting him from knowledge that would have made staying impossible. Miriam Cole had been the overnight manager of Carrington Grand for more than 30 years. She had been let go 8 weeks before the hotel's operational suspension in what her termination letter called a workforce restructuring. Camille found her through a former employee network. Miriam remembered the night of the 3rd of November without prompting because Malcolm Ashbourne had arrived at the hotel that same evening. Unusual, because he rarely came to the Grand in person and never without an advance call. She remembered raised voices behind the closed door of the private dining room where Harlan held informal meetings. Afterward, Harlan had asked her to remove a guest's name from the physical sign-in log. She had done so. She had also, because 40 years of careful habit did not disappear on request, made a copy of the relevant page and filed it at home. The copy confirmed that Elise Hale had signed in at 8:43 in the evening and out at 10:17. It confirmed that Malcolm Ashbourne had arrived at 9:51, while she was still inside, and had not signed in at all, a violation of the hotel's own security protocol. The voice recording in room 1308 supplied the rest. Harlan had believed Elise's report and given Malcolm 30 days to begin unwinding the Northbridge structure. Malcolm had used those 30 days to build additional legal distance between himself and the transfers, consolidate his board position, and arrange for Elise's departure under terms that made contesting her exit professionally and financially ruinous. The non-disclosure agreement she had signed was exchanged for the company's continued payment of her medical insurance. Harlan had told himself he was protecting thousands of jobs. He had continued telling himself this for years. Wyatt did not tell Evelyn he was angry at her father. He gave her the facts in the order they had occurred and let her make of them what she would. She did not defend Harlan. She said he had always described silence as a form of responsibility, and that she had spent years trying to understand whether he was right, and that she now believed he had been describing something real and applying it to something wrong. Wyatt said the distinction mattered. She said she knew. Then she apologized. Not on behalf of the previous generation, not with the qualifying language of someone managing legal exposure, but as the person who currently led the company that had made his wife sign away her name to protect a secret that was not hers to keep. He told her an apology was worth something only if she was prepared to make the truth public, even the parts that damaged the Carrington name. She stood at his kitchen table and did not answer immediately, because the calculation she was running was not personal. It was the 4,200 employees whose pension security, severance, and health care were tied to the company's valuation. He understood the calculation. He did not take back what he had said. Miriam mentioned, almost as an afterthought over a second cup of coffee, that the brass key to room 1308 was not only a room key. It was a master key to the hotel's original mechanical locking system, pre-digital infrastructure that included a series of archive cabinets in the basement level, installed during the building's original construction and never connected to the electronic network that had replaced the surface locks in the 1990s. Malcolm's counteroffensive came in the form of a document package released through a financial communications firm. It included Wyatt's employment records, noting his salary history with the Carrington family. Compensation, the materials carefully observed, significantly above standard market rate for a private driver. The implication was framed as a question, the way these things always are. A video clip followed. Security footage edited to isolate the moment. Evelyn leaned forward in the back seat. cropped to remove the parking structure context, presented without the word "tonight" being audible. The image was the message. The board convened an emergency session and formally requested that Evelyn take administrative action to sever Wyatt from any continued association with the company, citing the reputational impact of the ongoing media narrative. 6 members voted for the resolution. 3 abstained. Evelyn said she would make a personnel announcement before the close of business. Paige called that afternoon, her voice carefully steady in the way that children of composed people learn early how to sound. She asked if he needed her to come home. He said no, and meant it, and she accepted this because she understood him well enough to know when a no was real and when it was protective. Before she hung up, she said that he had spent 13 years making sure other people arrived where they needed to be, and that it seemed like the person who still had not figured out where he was going was him. He had no answer for that. When Evelyn came to him in the early evening, she offered to cover his legal costs and provide a financial settlement she described as compensation for service beyond the formal scope of his employment. He declined. He said that accepting money from her at this moment would accomplish exactly what Malcolm wanted. It would transform the narrative from a conspiracy to suppress financial fraud into a story about a wealthy woman paying a convenient man to manage a problem she had created. She said he was being unnecessarily rigid. He said she was confusing generosity with control. She said that was not fair. He said probably not, but that they were both doing the same thing, carrying the situation alone because neither of them had worked out how to admit they needed the other one. They were in his garage, away from the cameras both of them understood were positioned somewhere outside. Evelyn said that in 13 years, the time she spent in his car had been the only portion of her day when she was not performing a version of herself for an audience. Wyatt said he had taken the long route whenever the schedule allowed. He said it without looking at her, and then looked at her immediately afterward, which made the admission more complete than he had intended. They stood on opposite sides of the work table, and the space between them was not distance so much as the accumulated weight of a professional boundary both of them had observed faithfully and neither had fully believed in. The following morning, Evelyn issued a formal statement that Wyatt Hale was no longer employed by Carrington Meridian in any capacity. The language was administrative and precise. He read it on his phone in his driveway and felt something shift in his chest that required more vocabulary than he currently had available. He got in his car. He was already backing out when he noticed the small envelope on the passenger seat. Inside was the brass key, with a note in Evelyn's handwriting. This time, trust me until morning. The dismissal had been coordinated with Camille 2 days in advance. As long as Wyatt remained a Carrington Meridian employee, his movements were subject to the company's security monitoring infrastructure, the same system Jordan Pike had been providing to Malcolm in a truncated but useful form. Once formally severed, he was a private citizen who could enter a building he had been invited into by its owner without appearing on any corporate access log. Miriam led them through the laundry service corridor on the sub-basement level, navigating by memory through a passage that smelled of damp concrete. The brass key operated a panel of cabinet locks at the far end of a storage room that did not appear on any current building map. What they found inside had the organized intention of a system built by someone who expected to be gone before it was found. The original copy of Elise's audit report with her handwritten annotations, the hotel's mechanical guest registry covering years before the digital system was installed, an audio tape containing a recorded argument between Harlan and Malcolm in specific and damaging terms, and a list of 23 corporate entities connected to Northbridge Hospitality. What was not there was the final transfer through authorization, the document linking specific outgoing transactions to specific approvals. Evelyn had predicted this absence. She had predicted it because she understood Malcolm. A man who did not trust intermediaries would keep the most incriminating piece on his person, which meant they needed him to bring it to them. Jordan Pike had been given the opportunity by Wyatt to hear Harlan's recording in a parked car outside the Grand. He listened with the stillness of someone receiving information that rearranges the meaning of several years of his own decisions. He was not corrupt in the thoroughgoing sense. He had made a series of accommodations, each one slightly more costly than the last, until the accumulated debt became a position he would not have chosen at the beginning. He told Malcolm that the basement archive had been located but not fully accessed, that there appeared to be one additional locked cabinet the key had not yet opened, that the preservation order was expected within 24 hours. Malcolm, consistent with his entire approach to difficult situations, decided to handle it personally. He arrived at Carrington Grand at 11:47 in the evening, carrying a leather briefcase that Evelyn recognized from across the lobby, dark brown, brass lock on the left latch, her father's. It had been on Harlan's desk the morning he died and had not appeared in any estate inventory. She had asked about it. She had been told it was probably misplaced in the final weeks. Watching Malcolm cross the lobby with it, she understood it had never been misplaced. The board had assembled in the Grand's ballroom for what Evelyn's meeting notice described as a final review of acquisition terms before signature. Malcolm arrived confident, the briefcase at his side, expecting to witness the completion of what he had spent years building. He took his seat. He placed the briefcase under his chair. He let himself feel, briefly, the particular satisfaction of a plan that had survived every complication. Evelyn spoke without preamble. She confirmed that she had given the hotel key to Wyatt Hale, knowingly, deliberately, and with full awareness of what room 1308 contained. She did not frame this as confession or defense. She said, "I gave the key to the only person in this building who has never sold my schedule, my secrets, or my trust." Then she opened the folder Camille had prepared and began distributing copies. Malcolm said the materials had been gathered by a terminated employee with a personal grievance, that the chain of custody was compromised, that the handwritten notes of a private driver did not constitute admissible evidence of corporate fraud. He was not wrong about any of this in a purely technical sense, and he knew it, and Evelyn knew it, which was why she had prepared something more than documents. The external records were methodical. A fuel receipt with a timestamp, a traffic camera image of Wyatt's vehicle at Northwestern Memorial on the evening of the 17th of September, a parking validation ticket from the hospital's visitor structure. Together, they established Evelyn's whereabouts on each date that a forged signature had placed her in a meeting she had never attended. The mechanical hotel registry Miriam had preserved added its own layer, placing Malcolm in the building on 8 unscheduled evenings. The audio tape from the basement archive played through a speaker system that filled the room with Harlan's voice, and then Malcolm's, arguing in terms specific enough to be ruinous, without requiring translation. Jordan Pike entered and confirmed, under his own authority as the company's former security director, that surveillance data on Evelyn's movements had been shared with Malcolm Ashbourne on 14 separate occasions over the previous 8 months without her knowledge. He had brought the access logs. One of the board members asked Malcolm to explain the contents of the briefcase under his chair. The briefcase documented in a photograph of Harlan's desk, taken the last day of his life. Malcolm said it was personal property. He was asked whether he would submit it to independent review given the questions just raised. He said no. He said no again when the question was repeated. 3 members asked simultaneously why the answer was no if the contents were personal. The answer, as everyone understood, was that the briefcase contained the original transfer authorizations, the final link in the chain, and that Malcolm had carried them to the hotel, intending to feed them into the industrial shredding equipment in the sub-basement while the board meeting provided his alibi. Evelyn called for a vote to suspend Malcolm's authority pending independent audit, 7-2. The briefcase did not leave the room. As the session adjourned and the attorneys began securing materials, Malcolm looked at Wyatt, who had entered the ballroom partway through the proceedings and stood near the back wall without speaking, and said that none of this would have happened if a driver had understood the limits of his position. Wyatt looked at him for a moment and said, "For 13 years, my position was to watch the road ahead. You should have tried it once." The investigation that followed took 4 months and involved 3 regulatory agencies, a forensic accounting firm, and a federal inquiry into the pension fund transfers that identified $11 million redirected through the Northbridge structure over 6 years. Malcolm was removed from the board, his related assets frozen pending civil litigation. Jordan Pike entered a cooperation agreement, disclosed the full scope of the surveillance operation, and resigned with a formal acknowledgement of his role. The sale of Carrington Grand was canceled. The hotel remained standing. Evelyn addressed Carrington Meridian's staff in a company-wide communication that was notable for 3 specific admissions: that an internal auditor had discovered fraud years before it was disclosed, that the company's previous leadership had chosen institutional protection over individual accountability, and that the failure to act on that report had caused direct financial harm to employees who had trusted the company with their retirements. She announced a compensation fund for affected employees and their families. She did not use the word oversight. She used the word failure, which required more from her and meant more to the people reading it. The internal record for Elise Hale was corrected through a formal board resolution. The original compliance finding was overturned, replaced with documentation recognizing her as the first person in the company's history to formally identify the Northbridge fraud. Her name was added to a registry Evelyn created specifically to hold it, employees who had acted with professional integrity at personal cost. Evelyn gave Wyatt the letter Harlan had written in his final months, addressed to Wyatt by name, asking his forgiveness, acknowledging that the silence Harlan had chosen had purchased the company's survival at the cost of Elise's reputation, and Wyatt's right to understand what had happened to his wife. Wyatt read it twice, folded it, and placed it in the box where he kept her things. He did not say he forgave Harlan. He said that restoring Elise's name was the thing that mattered, and that a letter from the dead to the living was not the same as making right what could have been made right while there was still time. Evelyn offered him his position back with a renegotiated contract. Wyatt declined. He said returning to the role of her driver while he was feeling what he was feeling would make it impossible for either of them to know whether what existed between them was real or was simply 13 years of proximity reformatting itself under pressure. He said he needed to know the difference. She said she understood, in a tone that suggested she respected the reasoning and did not entirely like it. He opened his small transportation service 3 weeks after leaving Carrington Meridian, using his own capital, declining a gift she had worded carefully to avoid sounding like charity. Carrington Meridian became his first contracted client under a standard commercial agreement with transparent pricing and no personal favors embedded in the terms. The afternoon that contract was signed, she asked the question he had been expecting: whether leaving the job meant leaving her as well. He did not answer immediately. He told her that for the first time in 13 years, she was going to have to decide where she wanted to go. He was no longer the one with the route planned. 4 months after the investigation concluded, Carrington Meridian completed its restructuring under a revised board and a published governance framework Evelyn had insisted on as a condition of continuing as CEO. Carrington Grand remained open, its renovation funded through a combination of insurance proceeds and a preservation grant. A section of the building's lower floors was converted into a corporate history archive and professional ethics training center. Room 1308 was preserved intact, with a small plaque outside its door listing the name of Elise Hale, alongside the names of 3 other employees who had filed internal reports the company had failed to act upon. It was not a monument to Harlan. It was something quieter than that, and more honest. Wyatt's business had acquired 7 regular clients, and 3 drivers he had hired through a vocational program Paige had helped him locate. She had returned for a semester break and spent 2 days in the new office organizing route efficiency data with the precise focus she had inherited from both her parents. She noticed, without mentioning it until the second evening, that her father checked his phone at 11 in the morning and again at 6 in the evening with a consistency that did not match any current client's schedule. Over takeout at his kitchen table, she asked about it. He said it was nothing specific. She said he had driven someone else's life for 13 years with perfect dedication, and that the energy for that kind of care had to be going somewhere now. He said that was not a fair observation. She said she was not trying to be fair. Evelyn came on a Thursday afternoon, without an assistant or a security detail or a driver, a configuration Wyatt recognized as deliberate before she reached his door. She was carrying the brass key in a small glass case. She said the first time she had given it to him, she had been afraid and under observation and had used the only shorthand available in the 30 seconds before Malcolm reached the car. She said she was not using a brass key in a single word this time. She said she wanted to have dinner with him. Not as CEO and former driver, not as parties to a commercial contract, but as 2 adults who had spent 13 years in a car together and had both been, in their separate ways, waiting to find out if there was anything on the other side of the obligation. He asked if she was certain she was not simply seeking the particular safety of someone whose presence had been consistent for over a decade. She said, "Knowing you'll drive me home is safety. Wanting you still there after the drive is done is something else." He stood in the doorway and considered this for a moment. Then he said yes, and that they would go slowly, and she nodded as though she had expected exactly that answer. He reached for his car keys. She put her hand out for them. He looked at her. She said she would drive. He said he did not know how to be a passenger. She said he had 13 years to learn and had clearly not started, so perhaps this was a reasonable time to begin. Paige appeared briefly in the doorway of the back office. She had been finishing a document and had no particular reason to be standing there except the excellent one of wanting to see what happened next, and caught her father's eye for exactly 1 second before retreating. What she saw was enough. Wyatt settled into the passenger seat and found the angle unfamiliar, the absence of the wheel in his hands a kind of productive discomfort. Evelyn adjusted the mirrors and pulled onto the road heading north, navigating the city in a way that told him she had paid more attention to his routes over the years than she had ever acknowledged. When they reached the intersection that would have turned toward the Carrington estate, she continued straight. He asked where she was going. She said she was not sure yet. He told her to follow the road by the water. The lights were better there. She kept her eyes forward. At the last moment before the highway merged away from the lake, she said, "Tonight, we don't need to go home just yet." The car moved along the lakefront in the city's amber light, heading somewhere neither of them had scheduled, on a route that belonged to no standing obligation and no prior arrangement, only to 2 people who had spent 13 years circling the same destination and had finally agreed, without quite saying so, to find out what it looked like when neither of them was the one being driven. For 13 years, Wyatt Hale had been the one watching the road, so that Evelyn Carrington never had to. But on the night she finally took the wheel and asked nothing of him except to stay, both of them began to understand what it meant to find their way home together.